the mind, colloquially, it can be within and without the body. So there are many instances in popular literature, as an example, and certainly in, some of the sort of pseudoscientific literature about the mind being collective, right? That was Jung. Carl Jung talked about the collective unconscious, this idea that the mind is sort of a shared cultural collectivist concept. I think scientists and neuroscientists, certainly psychologists, don't consider very often, anymore anyway, we don't really conceptualize the mind as external to the body. We really think of it as internal to the individual and to one's own sort of habitus and person. And from a neuroscientific perspective, we conceptualize that the mind is in the conscious mind, effectively, in the conscious brain, rather. So that is mostly harbored in the prefrontal cortex. So if you touch your hand to your forehead, it's sort of in that orbital sphere that you would be holding on to in your hand. It's very recent that the World Health Organization actually allowed and has constituted the microbiome, which is the constitution of all microbiota in your gut, as an organ onto itself, which has huge implications and ramifications for how we conceptualize the gut and its power in determining certainly the neurons that fire together and wire together, but a person's biotic makeup and metabolic makeup, and therefore psychology and mindset and attitudes and behaviors and so on. So it's infinitely sort of interesting to me, these examples that
absolutely,
there's a definitive inextricable link between mind and body. And I think from a neuroscientist's perspective, that mind is held in the conscious brain. But basically there's this organ called the brain, and it operates in symbiosis with all these other organs. And it acts on those organs, and equally and effectively, those organs act on the brain and on the mind. And I think that connection is sort of endlessly interesting.
But one of the things that you and I got into a discussion about very early on when we first met was about Dr. Joe Dispenza, who brings into this discussion some sort of new research into quantum physics even. And he goes so far as to say that, you can almost think yourself out of illness. I mean, what are the limits? How powerful is this organ or is the mind?
Dr. Joe Dispenza, he talks a lot about, as you mentioned, that exact sort of connection, not just mind and body. He also connects it to spirituality and to soul, right? And to one's faith, as example, I think, as a spiritual, faithful person himself. He wouldn't be in the minority. As an example, Norman Doidge, who you mentioned earlier, would believe has evidence of, patients who have thought themselves through and away from illness. And the idea is that a lot of illness in our current concept of diagnostics, certainly in the medical profession and in the psychiatric profession, a lot of that illness is really, it starts with some of the psychosomatics, right? With some of how the brain is treating the body and what chemicals it washes the body and all of its cells in, and vice versa. And so, again, inextricably linked. And if we kind of imagine that there isn't such a dichotomy, if we imagine that we are very much an animal, that our brain is one organ amongst many, that they are all inextricably linked, that they affect and impact each other, we start to see it as, I would want to say, almost a complete homeostatic system. Mm-hmm. That then you realize a disease in one organ is not limited to that organ, even if, as an example, cancer is the best example, because both from an imaging perspective as well as from a diagnostic perspective, we localize that cancer. We say it's cancer of the something or other. But really, I like to systematize that and say it can't possibly be cancer of the, whatever the is, if this is all one system, if this is all an interconnected, inextricably linked system. And it is the patients who talk about their process in controlling the cancer and in getting rid of their cancer, they very typically will transcend exactly what I'm describing, which is this concept of the dichotomy between brain and body, or mind and body. And what they'll say is that, conceptualizing that meant that if those cells were going to be healthy, every cell had to be healthy. And if those cells were going to be changed and, stop rapidly mitotically dividing, then all cells had to have some mitotic control. And they started to conceptualize sort of the whole system in a much more homeostatic way, and tried to develop more equilibrium in that system. And that is where I think the Joe Dispenza stuff, the spirituality, the cosmos, the quantum physics of it all, that's where this really starts to enter in, is when they conceptualize that, listen, this is a systems theory, it's a systems thinking theory, but the idea is that if one organ is inextricably linked to all other organs, then all other organs are inextricably linked to their environment. And if they're all inextricably linked to their environment, then that environment is almost like Russian nesting dolls, inextricably linked to every other greater macro force and circumstance around it, right? So like you and I are in a city, and around that city is a state, and around that state is a country, and around that country is et cetera, et cetera. And you can get big until you're on this microspec called Earth, and there's this whole universe out there. So I think it's really the connection of all of those things that started to coalesce for the patients that have been interviewed, and that I've read the sort of journals of, if you will, that have come back and said, I really started to realize that it wasn't my liver in isolation of all other things. It was my liver in connection to all other things. And that's what cured the cancer ultimately, was conceptualizing that not only were they inextricably linked, but if they were, there was control to be had. And so taking back that control, and not in that intrinsic sort of sense of, here's what I can do about this, and here's how I can help my liver, as an example. I'm just using it as an example. And
I believe it. I mean, I've got my grandfather, I think, intuited all of this, because, when he was younger, he was run over by a truck, and I'll spare the gory details, but the doctor said it was going to be physically impossible for him to walk again. Mm-hmm. He ended up walking perfectly well, without the aids of any walking aids, without a limp, without anything. He suffered from, I think, 3 different types of cancer. That's not what did him in. What did him in was dementia.
Yeah.
Right? Like it was a disease of the mind, ultimately, really, that ultimately got him. So I've witnessed this. Mm-hmm. And there's all kinds of other anecdotal evidence too, when you see, couples where one partner dies and then sort of very shortly after the other partner dies. It's as if, they die of a broken heart.
I've got big balls, I've got big